Good morning, everybody. This is George Wheeler with Shadow Track 24/7, and I'm here today with Tony Pelli from BSI, who will be providing the cargo theft mapping and analyzing threats for supply chain, global supply chains. And we're going to give everybody just one more minute to get logged in, since we generally have a global audience for these presentations, especially the morning ones. So I want to make sure everybody gets in. So Tony will go ahead and get started in about 2 minutes with his actual presentation. Tony, I want to thank you very much for your time and being with us here today and sharing your expertise. And thank you to you and to BSI for allowing you to be on this virtual summit. Could you please just give everybody a background of yourself, maybe in BSI, before you get started? And then after that, you can jump right into your presentation, sir.
Okay. Thank you, George and Shadow Track, for giving me the opportunity to present to this group here. George approached me a few months ago. I thought this was a great idea, really a great new way to try to reach different audiences, new audiences, and try to get the word out to as many people as possible. So my name is Tony Pelli. I'm a supply chain risk consultant for BSI. So what we do is we help companies try to minimize their cargo theft losses, and we think that we have a pretty innovative way to do that through modeling their risk, forecasting their risk, and then trying to quantify the cargo theft risks that they'll face in the environments where they're operating. So I've done assessments for people in multiple different countries, multiple different continents, to help them reduce that risk, and that's part of what BSI does. BSI also offers a suite of software solutions to companies to help them manage risk in their supply chains, whether it's with their actual suppliers or if they're looking to get involved in new countries and they need to be aware of the risks in those countries. We can provide information on that as well. And we also have a team of auditors who can do cargo theft loss prevention auditing or security auditing in 150 countries, over 150 countries around the world. So my presentation today will be, hopefully, everyone is logged on now. Good morning, everyone, if you are logged on. So my presentation is about mapping and analyzing cargo theft threats. So it's not so much about looking geographically where are cargo theft threats, but it's a way to think about cargo theft and cargo theft risk that will help you wherever you're operating. So there's certain levers that we've found, or certain factors that contribute to the risk of cargo theft, no matter where you are. So thinking about those different factors will help you determine your level of risk and help you maybe model or forecast your risk before you even get involved in a particular country, or before you even start moving cargo through a particular area. So just by way of an agenda, I've already done the introduction to BSI. We're going to talk about some of the things that are driving people's need to quantify or to get a better handle on their cargo theft risk. It's this more risk and tighter budget section. People are moving into riskier countries for cargo theft and other supply chain risks, but they're being asked to do it on tighter budgets, and they're being asked to really quantify and datatize, for lack of a better word, all of the inputs that they're looking at, because that's happening on the logistics side. It's happening on supply chain more generally. There's lots and lots of data for everything. So how do you put data and numbers to cargo theft? We're then going to look at some of the ways that we can evaluate cargo theft risk, and I'll run you through an example of how to model that risk for one particular case, so you can show a return on investment for the security measures that you're using, and then we'll have a quick conclusion slide to wrap that all up. So I've already introduced BSI. We have a whole range of services and solutions. Gave a quick overview earlier. If you're interested and the other things that BSI does, feel free to contact me or anybody else at BSI for information about any of the things that you see here or any of the things that I'm going to talk about today. So this is some of BSI's experiences. I mentioned doing assessments in all of these countries, over 20 years experience at BSI modeling these types of risks for a number of Fortune 500 and FTSE 250 companies in a wide range of industries. So what's driving the need to be more aware of your cargo theft risks? And there's a few different things that we see. In a survey of top supply chain managers, almost 80% said that managing profitability in the supply chain is a top concern. It's their highest overall concern. However, only 46% said that in the same survey said that managing supply chain security is a top concern. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. They're trying to squeeze more value out of supply chain and distribution, but managing security isn't necessarily top of mind. They see it as something that's almost solely a cost, that security is something that you pay for. It's not necessarily something that can have a return on investment, and they're unable to see what the return on investment on investing in security measures might be. Related to that, 100% of supply chain managers, according to this PwC survey, said that minimizing costs are a top value driver for supply chains. So that's being done in a number of ways in terms of logistics, in terms of supply chain. You have just-in-time production and warehousing, where you don't keep large stock in warehouses for longer periods of time. And there's a number of other ways that this is being done as well, cutting back on trucking costs, trying to get the lowest possible transportation costs, no matter what country it's in. And a lot of times that can compromise security by trying to just do it as cheaply, as quickly as possible. In addition to this, we're seeing another trend towards quantifying everything. And I always like to talk about a conference that I went to, now it's about a year ago, about supply chain and logistics more generally, not necessarily security. And there were ways to quantify everything. The number of hours that a driver has driven, automatically keep track of that. There were ways to try and automatically keep track of whether the driver had gotten enough sleep over the previous 7 days, quantifying where all of the trucks in your fleet are, quantifying how much fuel is in all those vehicles. So supply chain managers are trying to drive value out of those things as well. And security, it seems like, has not kept up in terms of trying to put numbers to what they do. And it can be more difficult for security just because if security people, security managers, corporate security teams are doing their job right, then nothing happens. There's no theft. So how do you put a number to that nothing? What is the value of basically nothing happening? And then that's what we try and do, is put a number to that nothing. One thing that's also happening in concert with this drive to drastically reduce costs throughout the supply chain is moving to riskier markets. More companies are doing business in countries like Nigeria, countries like Vietnam, which has massive increases in exports to the United States over the past 10 years, and in countries like the Philippines that have serious problems with militant groups, in some cases with just regular cargo theft in some cases in places like the Philippines, also seeing more problems with things like natural disasters in a place like the Philippines. It's not quite as stable or as predictable as doing business in Europe or the United States or even most parts of East Asia. So you're looking at a whole different set of risks in these countries that you wouldn't necessarily see in other countries. Of course, we will talk about some examples from more established markets in Europe, in the United States, or North America, but they're doing more business in these less predictable countries from a risk perspective, or more dangerous countries from a risk perspective. And what we typically see happens is this pendulum. As a result of this drive to cut costs and doing business in these risky places, we see that if a company has a loss, they'll increase spending on security for at least initially. So then maybe after a few years, 2 years down the line, a year down the line, they won't have any losses. And because of this relentless drive to reduce costs, they'll pull all that spending on security. No more GPS tracking for all of your loads. No more security escorts if that's the case. All of those things are pulled because they say, well, in the past 2 years, you haven't had a loss. Well, as a result of pulling all of that spending, of pulling those security measures, you eventually get losses again. So what we want to do is, and that's all very reactive. It's very responsive to individual events. Something happens, you say, oh crap, we need to change the way that we're doing security. What we want to do is make security teams more proactive, where they have an acceptable level of losses and efficient security spending. So only the amount of security spending that sort of is right for their needs or fits their needs. A lot of times we see people, they have a loss or something happens within their organization. They say, okay, we need everything. We need just pull out all the stops. Doesn't matter if it's how expensive it is. We're having so many losses. We're bleeding losses. We need to just buy everything to prevent losses possible. When that may not be necessarily the most effective way to actually prevent losses, and it's certainly not a cost-effective way to prevent losses. So we want a more sort of careful consideration of what will actually lead to decreased losses, and will lead to enough decrease in losses in order to justify the cost of those measures. So to step back a little bit from the sort of whole larger project of what we like to do in terms of forecasting and modeling risk. And we're going to think a little bit about some factors that can lead to cargo theft risk in individual places. So this is just something to think about as you're moving into new markets, as you're shipping in new areas. What are these drivers like in your area or the area where you're trying to evaluate risk? It should give you a pretty good idea, even if you know nothing else about the environment. If you know nothing about empirical cargo theft losses over the past 10 years in these places, you can look to some of these factors in order to try to evaluate what the risk will look like. So sometimes cargo theft risk is just a function of the geography of the country or where you're operating in a country. So Paris is my favorite example of this one. The Paris area sees about 60 to 70% of all thefts in France, which makes sense. I mean, it's a really large city. It's about 20% of France's population. Goods are going to the ports, the two major ports in France, Le Havre and in Calais. And then you also have things coming from Antwerp and Rotterdam in Belgium and the Netherlands. And you also have goods coming in from Western Germany, which is a big industrial hub in Western Germany, being shipped into Paris and through Paris to those other ports. It also is the second largest air cargo airport in Europe. So there's just such a concentration of transportation there, such a concentration of people there that, of course, there's just more targets for theft there. You're going to see organized criminals gravitate to a place like Paris in order to carry out thefts, just because it's so large. There's so many targets there. It's the same thing that we see with Western Germany and parts of the Western Netherlands, is that there's just so many transportation nodes there that it's almost a magnet for cargo theft for that reason alone. So you don't have to know anything about, you know, how many cargo thefts in the past 10 years have occurred in Paris to know that it's going to be a hotspot for theft. There are other areas where this is true as well. Memphis, for example, is a really good example. There's just so much in terms of air transportation that's coming into the United States in Memphis, so much that's going out because of one particularly famous freight forwarder that's based there. There's a lot of other warehouses there as well. It's right in the middle of the country. You don't need to know anything about the crime rates in Memphis, about the number of cargo thefts that have occurred in the past 5 years in Memphis, to know that Memphis is probably going to be a cargo theft hotspot. So thinking about those types of geographic indicators can help you get a good idea of what cargo theft will look like in any given place. And one thing that I keep talking about, you may not necessarily need to know about data over the past 10 years in order to predict what cargo theft will look like. There's a lot of reasons why the past may not be a reliable guide. And since we're coming up on Thanksgiving here, Thanksgiving in the United States at least, this is my sort of favorite example of why what you've seen in the past may not necessarily be a reliable guide to the future. First, there's certain reasons, like there's incomplete or uncertain data. In some countries, it's just very difficult to get cargo theft data. The authorities may not be forthcoming with that type of data. There's not a whole lot of independent news sources in a country that you can get that type of data from. There's not a lot of other companies doing business in that country that you can get data from. And so in most cases, your data is going to be incomplete or pretty uncertain. The second thing is that the past isn't the present. So this seems obvious, but in a lot of places, there may be events that can cause cargo theft to spike or decrease that may not necessarily be able to be predicted. So Spain's a good example. After the crisis in 2009 in Spain, you saw a massive increase in cargo theft that was sort of unrelated to anything that you'd seen before. If you were looking at cargo theft data for the early 2000s for Spain, you'd say this is sort of a medium risk country, probably not quite as risky as in Italy, but not as low risk as a place like Germany or Denmark, for example. And then an event happens that sort of changes all of that. And my favorite example here is the Thanksgiving turkey. If you just looked at the life of a Thanksgiving turkey, he's happy, he's on the farm, his quality of life is very good until Thanksgiving Day, when he is, or the day before Thanksgiving Day when he's killed to be a Thanksgiving turkey. That's why it's important to sort of evaluate the environment as well. So look at things like crime rates, corruption, other outside factors, like the turkey. You need to know that he's on a turkey farm, and then say, well, maybe his quality of life isn't going to continue increasing beyond a certain point. As I was saying, like the financial crisis in Spain, there's certain low frequency, high magnitude events that are, possible or even likely. Italy and pharmaceutical theft is another example here as well. So, it would have been fairly difficult to predict that in 2014 and 2015 we saw this massive spike in pharmaceutical theft in Italy. But some of the other factors were already there. We knew that there was a lot of organized crime in Italy that carried out other types of cargo thefts. We knew that there was a lot of pharmaceutical production in Italy. It's one of Europe's largest producers of pharmaceuticals. So it was only a matter of time before those two things collided. It was just sort of really a coincidence that they hadn't yet. Massive amounts of organized crime, higher levels of corruption in southern Italy, and a lot of insider theft. So you could look at all of those factors, even if you hadn't seen any pharmaceutical thefts in Italy in the past 15 years, and say, well, it's probably pretty high risk for that type of theft or that sort of theft, even without knowing anything about the number of pharmaceutical thefts that we've seen in the past 10 years. There's also other different country risk factors that you can look at to give you an idea of what increases or decreases cargo theft risk. And one thing that we've noticed at BSI in particular, when we've been doing analysis on country cargo theft rates and other factors that correlate with it, is that there's this idea called the middle income trap, where countries get stuck in middle income per capita GDP ranges. So they're not low income countries like, say, a Cambodia or a Laos, but they're not really high income countries like the United States or Germany or Denmark. It's countries like Brazil, South Africa, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And the reason why we tend to see higher rates of cargo theft in these countries, well, first off, all of these countries that get stuck in this middle income trap, Indonesia is another example, Brazil is another example. You can see the examples here with our BSI cargo theft ratings. All the countries that get stuck in this middle income trap tend to have very high rates of cargo theft. And the reason we think that is because these countries are rich enough to have lots of consumer goods going through them. So, people there have iPhones, people there are able to afford certain types of nicer electronics or consumer goods or, cars, things like that. But things like rule of law and a lack of corruption hasn't really caught up to the level of wealth in those countries yet. So that's another thing to think about as well, is your country one of these middle income countries where there's still high levels of corruption, there's relatively poor rule of law, but it's a fairly wealthy country. So there's a disconnect between those two things. Law enforcement may not be as effective at preventing cargo theft in countries like this. The EU is also a sort of interesting or special example here. You can see this map has low-income areas in the EU in red, and then higher-income areas in the EU sort of in green there. And because the EU essentially functions as one large country, a lot of times what you see is people moving from those areas where there's higher levels of corruption, poor rule of law, higher levels of organized criminal activity, areas like southern Italy, for example, parts of Spain, into areas where all the cargo is essentially. So Western Germany, the Paris metro area you can see there, the Madrid metro area, the London metro area, and northern Italy, places like Milan. So again, that's just sort of further proof of the sort of middle income idea that places where there's lower levels of rule of law, higher levels of corruption, even if they're sort of geographically separated, if they still function as one market as the EU does, you'll see movement between them to areas where there's higher concentrations of cargo that is available to steal. So that's the sort of special case with the EU there. And Brazil is just one example, probably the best example. It has the greatest number of cargo thefts of any country that BSI sees, over 19,000 cargo thefts each year. And we're actually seeing an increase in places like Rio de Janeiro for cargo theft in 2015 and into 2016, the rest of this year. BSI estimates cargo theft in Brazil at $1.5 billion per year, which is the second highest in the world after the United States. You also see plenty of use of heavy weaponry in cargo thefts. GPS jamming is extremely common in Brazil, and other really sophisticated modus operandi, especially for warehouse thefts in Brazil, where they have really heavy weapons. They may be former police officers themselves in a lot of cases who are carrying out these thefts, and they'll be in and out of an electronics warehouse with several $1 million worth of stolen in about 20 or 30 minutes. So this is, sort of really sophisticated levels of cargo theft in one of those middle income countries. And one thing that we're watching very closely If you've been following the news in China over the past year or so, China's economic growth has slowed pretty significantly over the past year. So our concern is that China is essentially going to turn into one of these middle-income trapped countries, where there's large numbers of consumer goods, there's demands for consumer goods, there's demands for different types of pharmaceuticals, as well as people begin to suffer from diseases like diabetes, or they're living longer and they get cancer, so they need pharmaceuticals to treat cancer. But things like rule of law and corruption don't necessarily keep up in China. There's still high levels of corruption, lower levels of rule of law in certain places. So China may get caught in this middle-income trap, and we're seeing some signs of that. So we see these moving truck thefts in China, and you can see some of the pictures here. It's actually really dramatic, where they'll pull up behind these trucks that are on the highway as they're moving on the highway at 50, 60 miles per hour, jump onto the trucks, usually soft-sided ones. And then as you can see here, the guy's on top of the truck, and they'll slash through the top of the truck and remove items from the truck. So we've seen leather products stolen in this manner. We've seen electronics stolen in this manner. We've seen pharmaceuticals stolen in this manner. Moving truck thefts are becoming more and more common in China. And it seems like in general, we are seeing more sophisticated forms of cargo theft in China. The example you see here is over $1 million of pharmaceuticals stolen over several years in an insider warehouse theft in China. So over several years, this disgruntled employee was just, every time he clocked in, was walking out with a small amount of pharmaceuticals each time. And it added up to over $1 million worth over several years. And the only reason it was discovered is because someone was doing, I guess, looking at the accounting or some of the inventory for the warehouse and realized this discrepancy. But the amount that was stolen each time was so small that you may not necessarily have noted it. So that's one thing to watch. China is becoming a more important consumer market, but it's also becoming a more dangerous cargo theft country as well. Another thing to think about as well is commodity risk. So think about the liquidity of your product when you're looking at cargo theft risk. So we like to categorize products into these different areas. There's certain things that are high value, but they're low liquidity. And what I mean by liquidity is how easy they are to sell on the black market. So think about sneakers. Sneakers are really easy to sell on the black market. Cigarettes are even easier. No one's going to question really where those cigarettes came from, where those shoes came from. And you can sell it very easily into just sort of a corner store or whatever the case may be. You can sell them very easily on the street. There are certain items, however, that are high value but are very low liquidity, and medical devices, I think, is a classic example here. If you steal an X-ray machine, it's going to be very difficult to then resell that X-ray machine because people are like, how do you have this? Why do you have this? There's no resale market for black market X-ray machines. There's also goods that are very high liquidity, but they're low value. So you make up for it by basically stealing them in volume. Consumer goods, things like just food, for example, would be in this category. Other types of consumer goods like toothbrushes or something would be in this category as well. They're low value and high liquidity. When they do get stolen, they get stolen in higher volumes to make up for their low value. There's some things, however, that are in this kind of this sweet spot where they're high value, but they're also high liquidity. So certain food items, more expensive food items, things like actually ribs randomly is something that we usually see in this category. Things like nuts. Nuts is really probably the greatest example, the best example. In 2015, we saw a rash of thefts of different types of nuts in California, and it's because if you go to the store, you buy almonds. They cost $9, $10 per pack. So you steal those. They're relatively high value. They're difficult to trace because they're a food item, and it's also an industry that was just completely unprepared for theft. They never expected, well, our item's relatively valuable. They just thought it's another agricultural product. We don't need to invest in security the way that you would for iPods or iPads or anything like that. Baby formula is another one that falls into that sweet spot where it's very easy to resell. There's a lucrative black market for it, but it's also relatively difficult to trace. Compared to something like electronics, where so many different types of electronics are able to connect to the internet now. When you connect to the internet, it also allows you to track them as well. That's not the case for something like baby formula or razors, which is one of those items that's high liquidity but also sort of relatively high value. So thinking about which of these three categories your product fits in can give you an idea of what the cargo theft risk is. The top one would be lowest, the middle one would be sort of medium cargo theft risk, and these bottom sort of high liquidity, high value items would be most at risk for cargo theft. So now we're going to run through an example of how we typically model risk. And let's say you're a corporate security officer or someone who's in charge of preventing losses in Europe. And you have a loss in the Paris area, as we talked about. It's a high risk area for cargo theft. That's costs $1.25 million. And these are your security spends throughout Europe. So in Germany, you're spending $500,000 on security. In England, you're spending $100,000. In France, $275,000, and so on. So what you want to know is that $275,000 cost effective to keep losses low, given that you've had that $1.25 million loss. And as we discussed earlier, in the Paris metro area in France, we want to look at those risk factors. So there's a high percentage of full truck thefts, a growing number of fictitious pickups in France in the Paris area, and it's very high risk for electronics in particular, which is what we're going to use for this example. We typically see those types of thefts happening outside of the Paris airport almost immediately as they're coming out of the airport. They go to one of the distribution centers there and they get robbed almost immediately, particularly for electronics. Electronics is a big one for theft in that area. So what we look at then is based on this model, you can say your unprotected loss forecast, if you're not using any security measures, is 1.25 million. Your protected loss forecast is going to be somewhat lower. If you're using certain types of security measures, if you're using GPS tracking, if you're using other types of tracking devices, you may be able to reduce those losses to $54,000. But then you also want to take into account the amount that you're spending on security, because that's a cost as well. So there's a cost in terms of how much is actually lost due to theft or how much is forecast to be lost due to theft. And then there's also a cost due to your actual security spending. In this case, however, there's still a positive return on investment of $921,000. And so if you're looking at on this chart here, the Q1 is what you have with unprotected losses. Q2 is what you have with your protected losses in terms of modeling or a forecast for your unprotected losses, which is what BSI does. We generate that loss forecast based on some of the factors that we've already talked about. These charts here show what we do as well. So basically, we run 1,000 trials of that scenario to give us what the average cargo theft loss would be. The Q3 right there shows you if you add in your security costs, what you're actually at, and the difference between Q3 and Q1 is your cost avoidance. That's the cost of nothing. Like I was talking about earlier, that's the amount that you're avoiding in terms of losses due to cargo theft. We like to see in general a 3-to-1 rate of return for your security spending. So for every dollar you spend on security, you should be getting $3 back in terms of avoided losses. And in this case, we fulfill that. You're getting $3.35 basically back for every dollar that you spend on security in France. So that's a case where you want to see if your security spending is in line with the actual risk that you're seeing in the place where you're operating. There's other cases, however, where you may want to know why are you spending so much? Can we safely reduce the amount that we're spending in a particular place? So you're spending $500,000, almost double what you're spending in France to secure your electronics in Germany. And we see this a lot. Let's say that Germany is your largest market for electronics. So of course, you're going to spend the most on security in that area. I see a lot of spending on security is based primarily on the volume or value that's being done in that country without really regard for the actual risk of cargo theft. So you may have a higher density of losses in the places where you actually have a smaller market, and that sort of adds up over time to being more expensive for you, rather than just sort of spending in the area where you have the greatest value. So Germany, in comparison to France, has less risk for your product, which in this case is electronics. Maybe you're doing business primarily in the ports of Germany that you can see here, which have a lower risk of cargo theft. One thing that we also see is that there's fewer full truck thefts in Germany. So even if you do have a loss, it's more likely to be a smaller loss. It's these sort of curtain slashing thefts or pilferage thefts that you can see here as an actual example from Germany, where they just cut in. They may take a few things, but they're not taking the entire truck basically. So it's easier to hedge against that as well. Maybe you could spend a little bit more to use hard-sided trailers. Maybe you could avoid parking in certain rest areas. in order to avoid that type of risk. So again, we're going to model the risk just to check. The unprotected loss forecast is $72,000 based on those factors that we evaluated earlier. The protected loss forecast, if you use some types of security measures, maybe you avoid parking in certain areas, maybe you do sort of simple driver ID checks or driver vetting before you give them custody of the load. The protected loss forecast is about $18,900. Your security spending is much higher in this country. It's close to $500,000. So again, if you take the unprotected loss forecast and subtract out the protected loss forecast and your security spending, it's the same Q1, Q2, and Q3 that we see here. Your return on investment is negative $446,000. So that's a poor return on investment. You should reduce spending in that area. Even though it's your largest market for electronics, the spending that you're doing on security there is just not cost effective. And that goes to sort of having security as a value in the supply chain rather than just a cost. You can actually help your supply chain managers, your logistics managers reduce costs in the supply chain by reducing security spending where it's warranted. So you maybe want to consider some lower cost security measures like pre-trip checklists, driver ID confirmation before he gets custody of the load, as a pre-alert of the driver's identity, and then double checking the identity when he picks up the load, and avoid parking in high-risk areas, some of which I've sort of outlined here for a particular part of Eastern Germany. And that can be based on crime rates that you're seeing in the area, that can be based on empirical cargo theft that you see in the area, or any of the other risk factors that we've talked about previously. So looking at some of these lower cost security measures in order to reduce the cost of your security. So now taking this sort of regional, you're spending a total of $1.175 million on security throughout the European region. You don't know how much in terms of losses you're actually avoiding. If you do the exercise that we just looked at across Europe for all of the different countries, you may be able to reduce your security spending in certain places because the risk just isn't as high regardless of how much you're actually shipping through those areas. So in this scenario, we've gone through and we've done that, and we've filled in what the risk actually is in all these areas. And we were able to reduce our security spending to $620,000 from that $1.175 million. Again, making security a sort of driver of value in the supply chain rather than just a cost. And this can actually work both ways. We can also discover through the forecasting and modeling that, hey, I know this is a relatively low volume area for us. We're not shipping as much in this area, but losses are going to be so high that it's just going to overwhelm whatever value we have in this area. So maybe we should spend a little more on security. And through this scenario, if we look at all these different countries, we were able to avoid $1.7 million of losses. And that's again, that cost of nothing. This is the cost that's avoided because of our security spending. So it allows you to, usually the supply chain and logistics guys will have really good numbers in terms of we're saving this much by cutting out this distribution center, or we're saving this much by doing just-in-time deliveries. And it's difficult for security to sort of argue against that or to put a number up against that. So what this exercise allows you to do, and the type of modeling that BSI does allows you to do, is to allow security to have an input in terms of a number for, here's what security is saving us on a yearly basis. And here's where we can cut costs, or here's where we need to increase costs based on the projections that we're seeing, and allows you to put a number up next to the numbers that logistics may be putting up, or supply chain may be putting up for the money they're saving by reducing a DC or doing just-in-time delivery, whatever the case may be. So in conclusion, we feel that risk is largely predictable and losses can be predicted based on a lot of those factors that we've looked at, those environmental factors that are always present in the country that you can usually get a pretty good handle on, even if you don't know anything about how many previous cargo thefts there's been in the country. The modeling of losses can focus product protection and security spending and loss prevention, which saves money. It puts a number to that nothing. If there's been no losses, it allows you to see how much loss you avoided, and it provides a way to prove and measure security and product protection spending, alongside some of those other groups that are that can very easily quantify their value to the business. So it allows you to show the value that security brings to your business. And those more proactive measures can help avoid costly losses. And in some cases, for more sensitive industries like food and pharmaceuticals, it can help you avoid recalls as well, because that tainted product is out there. And if you have any questions, I believe George is going to be sending out a copy of the presentation and of the recording for the presentation. I wrapped up, I think, a little bit early. But if there's any questions, feel free to give me a call or email me at the email address here. I'm sure if you email George as well, he can funnel the questions my way. BSI's website also has a running blog, which has discussions about a lot of the different things that I talked about today, discussions about country risk, about how to evaluate risk, about the best way to sort of look at risk in your supply chain. So there's a lot of great content on the website there as well. So again, I'd like to thank George and thank ShadowTrack for giving me the opportunity, and thank all of you for showing up today. And I hope you enjoyed it.
Tony, absolutely. Thank you very much for that presentation. Actually, I have a few questions here that not only I wrote down, but I also received from other people, either through my text message over here. But if you could answer for us, please. Someone was asking, you mentioned tighter budgets going into, organizations are going into countries they've never been before, and they're trying to go in there with tighter budgets. When you go into a country you've never done business before, and sometimes we're going to these emerging markets, and these emerging markets, they're going into those countries because they're taking advantage of lower labor rates generally, but their infrastructure may not be as great as some of the other countries which they're currently doing business. If they're going in there with tighter budgets, who are they squeezing? Are they squeezing the 3PLs for trying to get our transportation costs at lower costs? Or what is it that they're trying to cut out that they think they can go into these countries without kind of a major spend?
Yeah, a lot of times it is the 3PLs that they're squeezing in terms of transportation costs, and a lot of times it is labor as well. They're able to cut out labor even at the factory level, for example, in terms of production there. That's the lower cost as well. And a lot of times, even though it's a newer market, they may try to skimp on security spending as well as one thing that they're trying to cut out. So they may say, we know it's a new market, but we're not going to use any type of GPS tracking, no matter the value of the load, just because they're trying to squeeze costs out there. A lot of times it is on transportation though, and even if the infrastructure is not as good, they'll still be able to get those lower transportation costs for those countries, usually because labor is so much cheaper.
Okay, thank you. Another question was, and this is kind of an interesting thought, is cargo theft really an immigrant crime? Now, you show that, for example, in Paris, a lot of immigrants in France, in Paris, but we also know that's true with, say, Toronto in Canada, Miami in the United States. Is it safe to say that a lot of cargo crime is being perpetrated by immigrants, or is this domestic gangs?
It can depend. In Italy, usually it's domestic gangs, and by domestic gangs I mean like the mob, the mafia, usually from southern Italy. So even internally, there's sort of a migration from the south to the north in terms of criminals who are active in the south will move into the north to, because there's more going on up there in terms of things to steal. In Europe also, you see from Eastern Europe, so Polish theft gangs moving into Western Europe. In a lot of cases, it is about sort of the movement of people, and you highlighted some of the areas there. In Brazil, that's not so much the case. In South Africa, that's not so much the case. And I think it's more because in those areas you see higher levels of corruption. I mentioned former police officers being involved in crimes because they have access to weaponry, they have access to other types of information that allows them to more effectively carry out those crimes. The U.S. is just such a unique case with Cubans in South Florida because you'll see people who come from Cuba and then they're able to basically get out of the country, and the U.S. can't touch them because they're going back to Cuba. So that's sort of a unique case, and for the Cubans in the United States, it's all types of crimes. It's identity theft and credit card fraud and all types of different things. So that's sort of a unique case. So in a lot of cases, yes, it can help to look at those movements of people to see how that's happening. But in some cases, corruption may be a larger factor in a place like South Africa or a place like Brazil.
Absolutely. One question I had is, how do you figure unprotected loss forecast?
Yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
Is that something you could share with us, how you get that number?
Yeah, so the exact formula is proprietary, but we do look at some of those factors. So of course we do look at past past levels of cargo theft, past cargo theft incidents, and BSI keeps a database of over 10,000 incidents from the past, just from the past 5 years alone. So we look at past cargo theft rates. We look at things like rule of law and corruption, and some of those other factors that we talked about in the presentation today to give us basically a rate for cargo theft. And that rate will be different depending on the commodity it's being shipped, depending on where it's being shipped, which country, where within the country, the modality that's being shipped. And that's how we generate that unprotected loss rate.
Okay, and then I suppose the same thing goes for understanding the protected loss rate?
Yeah, we look at different security measures. So we have an idea of generally how effective different security measures are, if they're being implemented correctly, which of course is a whole nother issue. So we have an idea of how effective those are at reducing cargo theft, and that'll be factored into the lower rate for the protected loss forecast.
Okay, thank you. And one question I have, and it's kind of a discussion, and actually, that I'd like to have with you for just a second, and that is, you talked about an organization's spend on security. When they're looking at, if I'm a shipper, and I'm looking at, okay, I need to spend X amount of money on security in any given country, doesn't matter what the country is. I can transfer some of that cost though, can't I? I don't have to spend that full set, 500,000, for example, by myself. Yeah. You showed a picture of a truck with a soft side that was cut open. If I just tell the carrier that they have to use hard-sided trucks, I can I can reduce my cost, my loss, but it hasn't actually cost me any more money.
Exactly, yeah, and that's usually one of the first things we look to actually is how can you basically transfer? Can you transfer responsibility for the load? So looking at Incoterms is one thing, and then also we usually basically almost always ask, what does your contract with your transportation providers look like? What are you forcing them to do basically? So we try to say, is there anything you can do in terms of offloading costs to them? Before you start looking at increasing costs yourself. That's exactly right. And looking at usually building that into contracts with your transportation service providers is one way that you can help reduce those costs. Sometimes you may get some pushback, but doing this type of modeling actually can help with that as well, because you can say, look, we know that this area is higher risk. We know that you're going to suffer losses. It's in your interest as well to sort of use some of these measures, or use some of these security measures. And really, hard-sided trailers isn't even really a security measure. It's just sort of a change in the way that they do business. So looking at those contracts can be one way to try and offload costs to them.
Absolutely, and definitely we recognize that just because you have a hard side doesn't necessarily mean it's more secure, but no. It does kind of deter a little bit of people just being able to cut open that side of the trailer and pilfer from you. And anything that you can do, all of these become layers, I guess, of security. That's a very small layer, a very thin layer, but nonetheless, it is an added layer of security.
And the other thing too that I think is important is to look at your processes as well. So, and that's part of the contract language in your relationship with the transportation service provider as well. There's different, as you're saying, there's different layers of security, and physical security is only one of them. Making sure that your transportation service provider has a culture of security where people are, I don't want to say like paranoid, but they're aware of security. Security is something that they think about on a daily basis, and it's something that they build into their freight handover processes, the way that they think about stops when they're shipping to different places. So checking up and making sure that security is part of the mindset at your transportation service provider can almost add another layer of security beyond the sort of physical layer.
Absolutely. I appreciate that very much, sir. And if anybody has any additional questions besides that, Tony's information is here on the screen, and you can reach out to him or BSI, who does a fantastic job with providing intelligence for the supply chain industry. And Tony, we thank you again for your time. I hope you have a good rest of your day today. For those of you in Asia, you all have a good night. And we will be back with you at 1 o'clock this afternoon for a presentation from Andrew Boyle. But for now, again, this is George Wheeler. Tony, thank you very much. And we will talk to you again soon, sir.
Sounds good. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.